and thank you for coming to this webinar. So I'm Georgina Andrews, I'm the General Secretary of the Young Communist League. And today our Holocaust Memorial Day event titled Never Forgotten Into Action Against Anti-Semitism is our commemoration event. So today is not only, well, yesterday, but Holocaust Memorial Day is not only a time for remembrance, but a day dedicated to the ongoing fight against the occurrence of past crimes. So on January 27th, 1945, the Soviet Red Army liberated the Auschwitz death camp, and the UN therefore designated it a day for global commemoration. And this year's theme is the fragility of freedom, and we have some wonderful speakers from a diverse range of backgrounds in the broad movement to speak on this topic. So they'll be providing some lessons learned and practical steps to combat anti-Semitism in Britain today. So the persecution of individuals before their industrialized mass murder shows a slow and subtle process. Genocides don't happen overnight, and there are intricate processes that unfold, creating an environment in which genocide can occur. And this includes forcibly stripping persecuted people of their freedom. But not only the persecuted people, but also the people around them to ensure the longevity of oppressive regimes. So in every genocide, people have their freedoms stripped away from them, but there are always people willing to risk their freedom and their lives to champion the cause of persecuted people. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust used the quote from Anne Frank to show this fragility of freedom and the severe restrictions on Jewish people during the Nazi regime. She said, "You couldn't do this and you couldn't do that, but life went on." But as we know, life didn't go on for Anne Frank and millions of other people deliberately murdered by a fascist regime. And this event is a reminder of that, and also a call to action in our workplaces, trade unions, communities. The Communist Party of Britain and the broad movement in Britain shoulders an extraordinary task of combating fascism, exposing Holocaust deniers, and defeating historical revisionism. And as this year's theme shows, we need to reflect on the fragility of our freedom and actively strengthen it in Britain. This is important in 2024 as we see popular disillusionment fueled by Tory austerity, pushing working class communities towards far-right activism and fascism. These movements propose false and nationalistic remedies to real-life problems, fostering support for the unjust restrictions on freedom on ourselves and also on scapegoated groups, including refugees facing perilous journeys crossing the Mediterranean and English Channel, as well as Black communities already settled in Britain. As we ponder these challenges, we need to ask ourselves, how do we mobilise our communities in favour of progressive responses to pressing issues such as austerity? As I said previously, we've got some wonderful speakers, and these are Rob Griffiths, who is the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Julia Bird from the Jewish Socialist Group, Lucy Burke, a member of the UCU Executive, and Dan Ross, a community campaigner, who will give their invaluable insights from the different work that they do. So hopefully we can have a brief Q&A session at the end. So please submit your questions to the Q&A function, and I will try to address these at the end. So thank you all for attending, and I will let Dan have the floor.
Thank you very much, Georgina. Can you hear me okay? Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to open up today discussing an important topic, which is the phenomenon of historical revisionism. I will take no more than 10 minutes or so to go through this. It's quite there's quite a lot to get through. I'm hoping there'll be some questions at the end, but if I rattle on, hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion afterwards. So as I say, the phenomenon of the historical revisionism and why it matters. I think firstly, the question is, what is historical revisionism? Well, put quite simply and prosaically, it is the amending of the historical record. It is something which is not on itself necessarily a bad thing. It can take place, for instance, when new knowledge or new information and evidence comes to light, and it is part of the ongoing development and recording of the historical record as we go ahead. It can also take the form of a political serving a political and an ideological agenda. And this is where the water can become quite muddied. And I think this is an area that we need to consider, particularly in light of the memory of the Holocaust itself. I think the second question, of course, is does it actually matter? I would suggest that if it didn't matter, nobody would do it. And I think it is important also because, as I say, the living memory and legacy of Holocaust survivors diminishes with every passing year. And I think it becomes incumbent upon us to uphold that memory more and more as that develops. I think I would argue as well equally that it is important because the phenomenon of historical revisionism serves to shape historical memory itself, and in doing so shapes the contemporary political discourse. So, how does this phenomenon actually manifest itself? Well, it doesn't emerge from a vacuum. I want to take a look at a little bit of history first and how this developed over time, and a few milestones that are quite significant in its development over the past 50 to 70 years. We'll go right back to the end of the Second World War in 1945 and the onset of the Cold War. It's little known, I think, in popular discourse that the significant swathes of serving Nazi officers, judges, police were rehabilitated back into civil society following the war, particularly in West Germany, but also across swathes of the Western world. Senior military officers were incorporated into the command structure of NATO, for instance, when it was founded some years later. Britain played a key role in the evacuation of Ukrainian Nazi collaborators and collusionists, and were transported and evacuated to Canada and North America. And there was also a lot of financial and other support that was provided to various ultra-right, ultra-nationalist insurrectionists actively operating in Ukraine throughout the 1950s. For instance, people like Stepan Bandera, who has come back to prominence in more recent years. So these collusionists and Nazi activists were provided shelter across North America, like I say, particularly in Canada. These groups were supported and were part of a reframing of the legacy of the Second World War, in part to serve the narrative, which was the Cold War against the Soviet Union from the 1940s onwards. These radical far right Ukrainian nationalists that took residency in Canada formed an organization called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or the OUN, who took an active role in reframing the narrative and the role of Ukrainian nationalists in the war. And it was reframed more as a war for national liberation against the Soviet occupation, if you like. So this is the sort of background. This is a swathe of the background of what we are sort of looking at from the 1940s right through to the sort of later stages of the 20th century. A couple of really key dates, I think, that need to be considered as well. And this is in the context of the dismantlement of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc in the early 1990s, which effectively had been a bulwark against fascism in Europe throughout its existence. From 1991 onwards, that bulwark ceased to exist, and fascism has seen a resurgence, almost an unfettered resurgence since then. So in that time, I think there's been a couple of key dates to look at. 2000 was, of course, the famous court case, which was the David Irving trial, where Deborah Lipstadt successfully defended against defended the libel case, and effectively brought to an end the period of Holocaust denial as an academic piece of discourse. What that in fact did was actually shift the debate away from overt Holocaust denial to something far more, I think, invidious, which is the development of Holocaust revision. What we effectively saw was the shifting of the debate away from Holocaust denial to essentially we have far right Nazi and fascist commentators saying that, okay, the Holocaust in fact happened, but it was only one of many. And this was, as I say, it's quite an invidious shift away, and it sort of changed the focus away from denying the Holocaust happened to simply seeing it as one of many atrocities that occurred in the 20th century. And this is a deliberate and confected attempt to sort of undermine and diminish the significance of the horror that was the Holocaust itself. So this is a really significant moment in the development of historical revisionism as a phenomenon. Another key date was 10 or so years later, around 2009, 2010, with what was called the Prague Declaration, which was championed by predominantly former socialist bloc countries like the Czech Republic and the Baltic states, and also the incorporation into the calendar of the European Union of the European Day of Remembrance, also known as Black Ribbon Day, which takes place every year on the 23rd of August, that being the date on which the Nazi and Soviet non-aggression pact was signed in 1939. It was also again deliberately confected to directly rival the legacy and the importance of today's commemoration, Holocaust Memorial Day, on the 27th of January. So these are some key dates that took place. The Prague Declaration and the Day of Remembrance are specifically, as I say, championed by these former socialist blocs, the capitalist restoration countries in Eastern Europe, which sought to establish the Soviet-Nazi joint culpability for effectively what we would call double genocide and the shared responsibility of the Second World War. And we've seen, for example, the building of anti-communist museums, the tearing down of wartime memorials across Central and Eastern Europe. We've even seen communist parties being banned. These post-socialist Soviet republics are particularly keen on championing this revision of history because their legitimacy is grounded upon it. It also serves to whitewash a very dark and dubious chapter from their respective pasts. A lot of these countries, for instance, Latvia, Estonia, even Ukraine itself, were directly active and enthusiastic participants in the Holocaust, and this is often forgotten in contemporary narratives. So, as I say, this shift away from Holocaust denial to Holocaust revision to see these the atrocities that took place in the late 1930s and the early 1940s were seen and contextualized as not being anti-Jewish pogroms, but retaliation and retribution against Soviet atrocities that took place allegedly in the 1930s in these countries. So we're seeing the diminishment of the historical record and the diminishment of the legacy of the Holocaust itself in these instances. So moving forward then, as I say, the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which took residency and took a significant and active role in reframing this narrative. We saw quite recently, actually, in I think it was September last year, where the Canadian Parliament made not one but two standing ovations for an active member of the SS, the Galicia division. It was a chap called Yaroslav Hunka, who was celebrated as a fighter for Ukrainian freedom against Russia. Chrystia Freeland, who's the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, her grandfather, Michael Chomiak, published a vehemently anti-Semitic newspaper during the occupation by the Nazis in what was then Poland, is now modern-day Ukraine. Karina Gold, another leading member of the governing Liberal Party, made appeals to not overly politicize the issue. Why am I mentioning this? Because it is in the context of that rewriting of Ukrainian history in Canada that this was able to take place at all. Obviously, the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion in 2022 has been framed in the context that what really matters in this debate is that these people, these Nazi fighters, people like Hunka, were fighting for Ukrainian freedom. That could not have happened without this reframing of the narrative over the past 50 to 60 years. They apologized for it, not because they made a naive mistake. They knew exactly who he was. As I say, Freeland's grandfather was actively engaged in this. They know exactly who this man was. They didn't apologize because they were caught. They didn't apologize because they were naive. They apologized because they were found out. And that's as simple as that. So it's within this context that it must be understood I think more broadly that there's a great propaganda coup in the West and in the imperial core, if you like, where the expropriation of terms like democracy and freedom have been used to justify interventions and wars that impose the very opposite. So we see the brutality of the French in Algeria and Vietnam, or the British in Ireland and India, or we see the United States in Latin America and the Middle East, where that brutality is permissible because it is done in the name of freedom. So this all ties into that legacy. We can equally apply the same thing to what's occurring in Ukraine and indeed in Palestine today. Historical revisionism, it provides the smokescreen for rehabilitating fascism and Holocaust inversion and Holocaust denial. It's the rewriting of European history and the rewriting of an uncomfortable shared legacy of the Holocaust, blurring the lines between the perpetrator and the liberator. To define and build the future, we need to understand the past. It is to the victims and to our own future that we must challenge the narrative that seeks to equate the liberators of Auschwitz with those who built it. I would just add finally that Holocaust Memorial Day actually shares commemoration with the lifting of the siege of Leningrad, which took place 1 year earlier in 1944. 1.2 million men, women, and children died as the Nazis attempted to murder and starve the city to death. Both of these commemorations serve, I think, as both fitting and timely reminders of the almost incalculable human cost that came with the defeat of fascism. And it is for that reason I think that it is important that we need to understand that past in order to build our future. I'm going to finish with a very quick quote from the author Sven Lindqvist, who wrote the book "Exterminate All the Brutes," which I find really resonant in this event. It is not knowledge we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and to draw conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dan. And yeah, I think it's really important to have a concrete understanding of historical revisionism, because it's, go out into our communities, it's not something people know about or are taught about in school necessarily. So thank you for that. So next we have Lucy, if you want to take the floor.
Thanks so much. And I want to say a big thanks to Phil Katz for suggesting that I come and speak today. Phil initially suggested it, I think because we'd had conversations about the fact I was the Labour Party candidate in 2019 in Bury South, and obviously that was a very difficult election. And in Bury South, we have one of the biggest Jewish communities outside London, and I spoke to lots and lots of people, and it was a really sort of important experience for me as well. I was kind of thrust into an election with two weeks' notice after being selected right at the last minute. So yeah, it was important. But what I want to talk about today is really, and I can sort of pick up a conversation about that sort of maybe at the end, is partly a kind of context for me standing, which was about my sort of personal, political and sort of academic kind of work around disability rights and the rights of disabled people, and what the shrinking of rights and attacks on disabled people sort of really mean, and what that kind of attack facilitates. So I'm going to talk about Action T4, which is the first extermination program in Nazi Germany, and one which is widely viewed as the precursor to the Holocaust in its endeavour to normalise and decriminalise murder. So T4 was a mass euthanasia program that enabled the murder of over 300,000 disabled adults and children between 1939 and 1945. And this included physically disabled people, people with epilepsy, people with Down syndrome, people with learning disabilities, and people with what we now call autism. But of course, autism wasn't really a category until 1940, a sort of noted category or diagnosis until 1945. So the T4 project was enabled by an order that was signed by Hitler in October 1939, but actually backdated to September, that charged the leader of the Reich, Philipp Bouhler, and Karl Brandt with the, and this is a quotation, with the responsibility of extending the authority of specially designated physicians so that patients who, after a very thorough review of their condition, are judged incurable and can be granted a mercy killing. So that was the language of the order, signed by Hitler on his own note paper. That was a directive to enable the mass slaughter of people in institutions for the mentally ill, but also the shipping of disabled children to hospitals to be killed. And it involved experimentation on disabled children too. Shortly before that order, there'd been a directive to the Reich Ministry of the Interior, which required the registration of all cognitively and physically disabled children. And sort of slightly prior to that as well, there was quite a famous case called the Nauer child case, which set a precedent for what was described as mercy killing. So a young physically impaired child was put to sleep, according to that language, in Leipzig University Hospital. And the sort of very painful part of that was this was at the behest of parents who had written to Hitler about this. So the ideological justification for this, it was twofold. A combination of the pursuit of racial purity as a central and core ideological element of the sort of Nazi regime, and ideas of racial health, which were far more widespread than simply the Nazi regime, but I can talk about that in a minute. And this idea that you must eradicate inherited conditions. But also alongside that, and this will be familiar to, and this remains familiar, this representation of disabled people as useless eaters and as major societal and economic burdens. So much earlier in 1920, there's a very famous essay by two German academics, Karl Binding and Alfred Hocher. They published an essay called "Permitting the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life," in which the ethical legitimacy of involuntary euthanasia was discussed. And what was interesting about this is there was an implicit, there was a kind of discussion of the fact that keeping people who were sort of intellectually disabled alive was really taking resources from injured soldiers, people who'd fought in the war and who required this sort of support and deserved the support of the state. So there was, you can see a really familiar move to differentiate between people who are worth support and those who aren't. And it's an ideological maneuver that we still see put into place, I think, today in terms of ideas of deserving and undeserving, the kind of people who really need to be helped and those who don't really need to be helped, and so on. So all of that is continues to be quite familiar in states which have mechanisms to provide support for people. So the point is that this idea was more widespread than simply happening in Nazi Germany or simply happening in Germany. So across the board in a lot of European countries at that time, there were arguments around enforced sterilization. For instance, some of the Nordic countries put into place the first legislation around this. And in Sweden, it continued to be okay to sterilize people up until 1977. And that was often, you were talking about people who were disabled, but also people who were viewed as kind of socially disruptive, women who were viewed as socially disruptive. So you've got enforced sterilization, the prohibition of marriage. So people with epilepsy not being allowed to marry, people who were deaf not being allowed to marry. On the grounds that you wanted to create the fittest and most kind of racially pure nation state. And those ideas were not just kind of right-wing ideas. They were also sort of people who viewed themselves as progressive, who held those ideas, particularly people who were making arguments that were otherwise good arguments around the accessibility of contraception. So all of the arguments of the early birth control movement involved degrees of eugenicism. And in this country, Mary Stopes, for instance, really disliked Irish Catholic working class women. And a lot of her arguments revolved around trying to contain their capacity to reproduce. So the really important thing about the T4 program in terms of what we're talking about and the ways in which projects will often begin with the most vulnerable groups of people is that they provide an ideological framework, and they provide the conditions and the language with which to justify what culminated in the mass murder of 6 million Jews. They enable that to happen ideologically, and they enable that to happen also with the kind of complicity or a role of doctors in facilitating these programs. So, you know, because of course on one level, participation of doctors lends scientific legitimacy to the principles of eugenics, upon which Nazis built their kind of racial policy and rationalizes murder under the logic of medical necessity. It's grim. There's some grim sort of statistics here, but more than 7% of all German physicians became members of the Nazi SS during World War II, compared with less than 1% of the general population. And by 1945, half of all German doctors had joined the Nazi party, in contrast with 6% before Adolf Hitler gained power. And there's some really interesting research about the willing participation of doctors. For instance, Rudolf Ramm, who was the author of a book on eugenics, noted that every doctor should be a physician to the Volk and a biological soldier. And Fritz Klein, who was a Nazi physician, justified his participation in the mass murder of Jews as follows, and this is a quote. "Of course, I am a doctor and want to preserve life, and out of respect for human life, I would remove a gangrenous appendix from a diseased body. The Jew is the gangrenous appendix in the body of mankind." So I think in all of this as well, you can see the power of euphemism and language to dehumanize the victims of that language, the people being described. And also, of course, the ways in which professional expertise and power lend weight to unconscionable practices. So I think in all of that, that's a kind of call to be alert to the kind of intersection of language and power in all of these processes, and the mobilization of justifications from various other discourses, science, and so on. So to come back to the idea of fragility, it's absolutely clear that the impulse to deny the full and equal humanity of disabled people continues. And at present, it's impossible to disentangle that from the reduction of the value of life to units of cost or productivity under capitalism. So this intersects with particular ideas of what makes human beings matter and what value means. And we continue to see really sort of respected academics in places like sort of Harvard, like Peter Singer, arguing that killing disabled children is justified in terms of the economic and familial burden they present. And there's a lot of evidence that those arguments underpin a lot of medical discourse today. And we only have to look at what happened in COVID and the imposition of do not resuscitate orders to recognise the persistence of those ideas. So 6 out of 10 people who died in COVID were disabled. 8 out of 10 deaths of learning disabled people were COVID related because people were denied critical care. So I think I wanted to talk about this because I think it's about understanding something about the human at the heart of all of these, and the point at which we begin to deny one group of people their humanity is the point at which we provide the conditions for stripping other people of that humanity as well. And you know, and the ways in which that can be underpinned by a whole set of legal sort of maneuvers of kind of justifications that allow people to disavow the equality of the other person that they're looking at. And the ways in which those ways of thinking, that language, those uses of euphemism, then make it impossible for people to see each other as humans as well. So the way that we see the world is shaped and framed by those discourses, which is why I think what's happening today, and particularly the instruments of social media in precluding anything like a kind of dialogue or a point to meet, is so dangerous and so damaging. So I'll end there, but to say that I think that we've never left that moment. We won't get beyond that moment, that kind of way of, and that capacity to strip people of their humanity whilst we live in a world which is so dominated by an economic model which is at odds with human well-being and human flourishing. And I'm a parent of a severely disabled child, and I will go to my grave worrying about what happens to him after I die. And I think the fact that that's experience of so many people is a kind of absolute indictment of the very broken system that we're living with. So thank you. I'll end there. But
thank you very much. And yeah, I think it just highlights, like I said in the introduction, the important task that we have in the broad movement and in Britain today. So thank you for that. So now I will let Rob talk.
Yes, thank you very much, Georgina, and to the two previous speakers who've highlighted such important aspects of the question that we're looking at today. In any event, to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, of course, we have to remember all the victims of the Holocaust. And there has been a tendency until recently to ignore a fairly large minority of the victims. Now that is being compensated, but at the same time, I suppose a fresh warning needs to be made that we also should not forget, as we're compensating for past omissions, we must never forget that the majority of the victims of the Holocaust were Jews, and this is not just a quantitative difference between Jews and other groups. It is a qualitative difference in the sense that the mass murder of so many million Jewish people was an act of genocide, and it clearly would meet the definition set out in the 1948 United Nations Convention, namely the destruction in whole or part of a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. That definition, of course, does not include people born with babies born with disabilities or children with disabilities, nor does it include the destruction of a whole group of people, or a part or a whole group of people on the grounds on political grounds, that they are political adversaries. But nevertheless, the destruction of so many Jews in the Holocaust clearly meets that definition. And we should not forget, so too does the planned and deliberate destruction of Romani people meet that definition as well. The extermination of the Jews, of course, on such a scale was made possible by a long history of anti-Semitism, not just in Germany, but in many other countries, including here in Britain. But anti-Semitism that was enormously intensified after Hitler and the Nazis took power, with the assistance, of course, of large parts of the capitalist class and of the conservative political establishment in Germany. But it was after that seizure of power at the beginning of 1933 that anti-Semitism in Germany took on an ever more vicious form. And that's why so many Germans, citizens of what until that point had been regarded as one of the most advanced civilized countries in the world, why so many Germans, but not only Germans, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Poles, Latvians, Lithuanians, directly participated in the Holocaust and its genocide. I do remember, by the way, in reference to Dan's earlier contribution, I do remember watching some episodes in the series in which Michael Palin toured the new Europe after the fall of communism, so-called, and visited the museum to the victims of genocide in Vilnius, in Lithuania. And of course, the only victims of genocide who featured in that museum were the alleged or real victims of the Soviet Union and the Red Army, particularly as they liberated Lithuania from Nazi rule. There is virtually no mention of the real victims of the Holocaust and genocide in that museum, supposedly dedicated to the victims of genocide. And in fact, again, perhaps not such a well-known fact, anti-Semitism basically virtually did not feature very much at all in the Nuremberg trials, unless it was brought out, particularly in the evidence of many of the witnesses to the Holocaust. It did not form part of any of the charges against the Nazi defendants, and in fact, neither was there any charge of genocide brought against the Nazi defendants. The concept was known by then, even though there was, as there still is today, some argumentation over exactly what it should be. But the broad concept of genocide was certainly well known in 1945 and 1946, when the Nuremberg trials began. The Western imperialist powers at the time were, of course, still and continued to be engaged in burying their own history of genocide, not least as far as the United States, Britain, France, and some prominent Western allies such as Australia were concerned. The Western powers who brought those charges together with the Soviet Union at Nuremberg, of course, were also, we now know, and some of the records are now available, were also preparing for the creation of a West German state, staffed by many anti-Semites and war criminals and Nazis and former Nazis, as part of the Cold War that had already begun. And that was a West German state to be part of the original plans to establish a European political community and a European defense community, scuppered by the communists and Gaullists in the French National Assembly. And later on, of course, within a few years, a West German state, complete with its Nazi bureaucrats and generals and intelligence chiefs and so on, that would become a member of NATO and the European Coal and Steel Community. Ever since that genocide convention, genocide and the convention itself, of course, have been weaponized in that Cold War against the Soviet Union, against China, against Laos, against Vietnam, and against the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan when it was supported by the Soviet Union. At the same time, the most flagrant and clearly documented breaches of the Genocide Convention were denied or played down or ignored when it came to the main Western imperialist powers or their allies. Again, sorry to give you so many lists at this so early on, but in the case particularly of France and French settlers in Algeria, in the case of Nigeria, the Nigerian government, assisted by Britain, in Biafra, the continuing genocidal policies in relation to the removal of children from their families, in the case of the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, and in the case of United States-backed dictatorships accused of genocide in Guatemala, Paraguay, against indigenous peoples. Oh, I've almost forgotten the case of Indonesia, backed again by Australia and the Western powers its genocidal policies in East Timor. Bringing it more up to date, we had the Iraqi genocide against the Kurds when Iraq was still regarded as a reliable ally and puppet of the United States, Britain, Germany, and other Western powers. Today, we have the issue, which we can't ignore, of the very serious charges of genocide being brought against Israel in Gaza, of course. And certainly it's my view and the view of the Communist Party, our declared view, that the Israeli policy in Gaza at the moment is a genocidal policy with genocidal intent. Anti-Semitism has also been weaponized during the Cold War, repeated charges against the Soviet Union, assisted, it has to be said, by some aspects of some Soviet policies in the past. That use of that weaponization of anti-Semitism was also used quite extensively. It's forgotten to some extent today, although it's been revived, against Marxism, against Karl Marx himself, who undoubtedly did share some rather prejudicial conceptions of his age when it came to Jews, particularly those Jews who'd been rejected or had been ejected or rejected from participation in a whole number of professions, and therefore tended to concentrate, middle-class Jews concentrated on the law, medicine, education in some countries, and in particular commerce and finance. But that falsification and exaggeration of problems of anti-Semitism in Marx and Marxism again, grossly exaggerated. I'll give just one example, because it's a book that is now being republished on quite a substantial scale, a book that was brought out in the United States, given the title A World Without Jews, with the author identified as Karl Marx. That's now repeated, by the way, in the standard entry in Wikipedia on anti-Semitism. Of course, Marx never wrote any such book called A World Without Jews. And in fact, the book in question is something he'd written in 1843, sometime before quite a few of his ideas were fully formed. It had the title back then of On the Jewish Question, a series of articles. There's no reference in there to a world without Jews, but the book is republished in a translation that is faulty in quite some serious respect, and given the title A World Without Jews, a phrase that doesn't exist in the book. And in fact, it's quite a complex philosophical work, but it only could be thought of as including any notion of a world without Jews, in the sense that Marx argues against all barriers and all discrimination against Jewish people, so that, like other more privileged parts of Western capitalist societies, there would be no special discrimination or distinction that discriminates against Jews. Only in that respect does he talk about a society in which there's no special category to be discriminated against, such as Jews. So in fact, it's a book that argues against anti-Semitism, although one or two of the formulations we would regard today as problematic. And that weaponization in the first Cold War against a weaponization of anti-Semitism, of course, was used quite widely against the left, against socialists, against communists, again, helped to some extent by some of the anti-Semitic prejudices that some early socialist leaders, such as Henry Heinemann in Britain, shared with wider society, including, in particular, some sections of the intelligentsia, the political establishment, and so on. And today, this is what's being revived on quite a significant scale. I've mentioned the republication of this book with the forged title. you will find a whole number of books now being published claiming that the left is anti-Semitic. It always has been anti-Semitic. The origins of socialism and communism and Marxism are anti-Semitic, and so on. There's quite a library of books now being published along this theme. Yet the reality, of course, is that throughout modern history, and still today, the left, socialists, communists, socialist and communist and left parties are very often in the forefront of the continuing struggle against anti-Semitism and historical revisionism, along with others, absolutely along with allies and others who have no time for anti-Semitism and understand that it must be stamped out wherever possible. And of course, many leaders of left and socialist and communist parties, many leading figures have been Jews themselves, as Jews have played such a progressive role in so many other fields, vital role in so many other fields of human activity and human progress. It's the right, it's the far right, it's fascism, who harbor or promote anti-Semites, who cloak their anti-Semitism in practice with fake accusations against the left, against those who act in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and they cloak their anti-Semitism too in their support for Israel, which of course is a support not rooted in any love for the Jews or any hostility towards anti-Semitism. It's rooted in imperialist policy in the Middle East. Just one or two points to finish. Of course, we shouldn't help. We shouldn't do anything that assists these new allegations of anti-Semitism and old ones against the left and socialist and communist parties. That's why we must make sure that our members, our supporters, don't use any of the traditional or even modern day anti-Semitic myths or illustrations or slogans. That our members understand that certain types of illustration and slogans and so on play into the hands of those who want to smear us as being anti-Semite. And the Communist Party has been taking action to ensure that our members do not post, particularly on social media, do not post some of these myths and images or slogans. You know, pictures of people with a Star of David, which is the symbol of all Jews, not just the symbol appropriated by the State of Israel, but the use of cartoons, supposed cartoons, where people in an Israeli flag or with a Star of David are tucking into a dead baby on a plate, or the use of the Star of David in pictures that seek to draw some equivalence between Israel and Nazi Germany, which is a false equivalence, despite the crimes of the Israeli government, or slogans which talk about the destruction of Israel, destruction of the state in the world with the second largest number of Jewish people. Imagine how that must look and seem to so many Jews, not only in Israel, but around the world. We must educate our own members. And that's why the Communist Party, for example, is bringing out a new program on anti-Semitism, so that our members understand what anti-Semitism is, as well as understanding what anti-Semitism is not. So, comrades, I'll finish by saying this. Our total opposition, for example, to the Israeli destruction of the Palestinians in Gaza as a national group, that genocidal policy, is made all the stronger by us being very clear about what anti-Semitism is, and by taking all the steps necessary to drive it out from any parts of the left where it may have gained some kind of toehold in recent years. And only in that way can we make those slogans that derive from the Holocaust and Holocaust Memorial Day a reality. Never forget, but also never again.
Thank you for that. And it would be amazing if everyone who's attended this event goes along to the programme when it launches, because that would be really important. So thank you, Rob. I will now pass over to Julia.
Thank you very much, Georgina, and thank you to all the people who've spoken so far. It's been really both interesting and engaging and really significant, all the things that you've been saying. And thank you for inviting me to speak here today on behalf of the Jewish Socialist Group. Holocaust Memorial Day is quite a recent innovation, which a lot of people don't realise. It was created on the 27th of January 2000, the 55th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army. And I'm going to talk a bit about the history and the responses at the time to what was happening to Jews in Poland. The name Auschwitz has come to be used as a shorthand for the entirety of the Nazi project. The Third Reich, a totalitarian empire in which they made detailed plans to exterminate the Jews and the Roma, and to persecute and enslave and murder anyone who they classified as inferior or likely to pollute the Germanic master race, according to their pernicious and elaborate racial theory, which Lucy has talked about in some detail. Auschwitz was not just a death camp, though. It was set up in the spring of 1940, close to the town of Oświęcim in southern Poland, as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners. These included communists, socialists, trade unionists, gays, and opponents of Nazism, including Jehovah's Witnesses. This site became Auschwitz I, which is now an incredible museum. When in the autumn of 1941, a separate site was established 2 miles away, Auschwitz-Birkenau, or Auschwitz II, it was renamed Auschwitz I. Birkenau was a vast flat site, baking hot in summer, absolutely bitterly cold in winter, with rows of wooden barracks where the inmates were stacked in tiers of wooden bunks. And there were 4 gas chambers. It was just a killing centre. Trains arrived directly at the camp, and as soon as people disembarked from the cattle trucks, if they'd survived the journey, they were selected to live or die. Their possessions were taken and sorted for anything that could be of value to the Third Reich. And the museum at Auschwitz I has displays of the things that didn't get transported back to Germany in time, like a massive container full of kitchen equipment and a massive container full of shoes, prosthetic limbs, unimaginable things. But there was another camp which most people don't know about, which was Auschwitz III, or Monowitz. This was set up to provide slave labourers for IG Farben's synthetic rubber works. Most, but not all of the slaves there were Jews, and they were literally worked to death. As soon as they were judged too weak to work, they were taken to Birkenau and gassed. So this was an economic enterprise. IG Farben paid a tiny amount for each slave labourer. It did not reach the slaves, and that was paid to the Nazis, and the Nazis provided these workers who were worked to death. The buildings, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the transport were all conceived and designed and carried out by educated people, skilled economists, accountants, planners, architects, engineers, bureaucrats, and managers. This was not a throwback to some earlier, more brutal time, and nor was it a unique, inexplicable period of madness, as it's often described, separate from anything else that was going on in the world or is going on in the world. This was an efficient system of mass murder that used existing industrial techniques and systems. More than 900,000 Jews and 21,000 Roma were gassed to death at Auschwitz-Birkenau, mainly between 1942 and 1944. Several thousand Soviet prisoners of war were gassed there too. This was the largest of a network of 6 death camps where around 2.7 million of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis were killed. But as other speakers have also alluded to, a similar number were murdered in mass shootings of Jewish civilians in Nazi-occupied areas, especially the Soviet Union. They were massacred by Einsatzgruppen units, which recruited willing collaborators from local non-Jewish populations in Ukraine, Belarus, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, where anti-Semitism was rife. Another method of mass murder was to force Jews into buildings, then set them on fire. Other Jews died from starvation or diseases that spread through the ghettos they were crowded into, where they were segregated from the outside world, isolated from other Jewish communities, and I'll say a bit more about that later. I've visited Auschwitz 3 times in recent years as a participant in an educational trip organized by Unite Against Fascism to enable trade unionist students and anti-racist, anti-fascist activists to learn about what happened there. Each time, what has preoccupied me the most has been the proximity of what we might call normal life to the barbarity and the process by which people get used to unspeakable crimes. One place I keep being drawn back to is the home of the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss. He and his wife and 5 children lived in an ordinary suburban middle-class house which abuts onto Auschwitz I. Their garden was within the sights and sounds and smells of watchtowers, crematoria, torture, and murder. And I'll show you a picture of that house because it's somehow the ordinariness of it is what's so shocking. There it is. And that I took that picture from the site of Auschwitz itself. So you can see it's a neighbor. Residents of Oswiecim, the nearby town, which prior to the war, I think was 50% Jewish, like a lot of towns that had very, very high Jewish populations. Residents of Oswiecim went to work at the camps every day. And I can't help thinking to myself, what were they thinking about as they ate their breakfast, as they helped their children pack their school bags, as they waited at the bus stop? And how long did it take for them to get used to the Nazi occupation of their town? Thinking about this is important because Auschwitz is not the whole story of fascism, and it was not inevitable. The death camps signify the end of a process in which ordinary, decent, moral human beings are set against each other and accommodate to authoritarianism, violence, atrocities, and genocide. That may have been a simple matter for some people who were convinced by the promises of National Socialism, but for most, it was an uneven trajectory full of conflict and fear and ambiguity. Heroism takes many forms, if we want to call it heroism at all, and courage is rarely an individual quality, but it grows and is supported by a network of human relationships. We can't always predict who will do the right thing. A Nazi official might turn a blind eye to their Jewish neighbors failing to add the names Israel or Sarah to their identity documents, as all Jews were ordered to do. And that small act of humanity might have saved their lives. But this too is the end of the story and not the whole story. How the Jews were ghettoized and then deported, who colluded with their segregation, how some people found the resources to resist, who supported them, what forms the resistance took. These are all questions we need to explore, not in search of some sort of hierarchy of heroism, but with humanity and open-heartedness, to understand how we can all gain the strength to stand up against authoritarianism, oppression, persecution, and discrimination today. A lot of the answers have their roots in life before the Nazis overran Europe. Our knowledge of that life is often obscured by the enormity of the destruction. But it's important to know that Jewish life in Poland, the country where the Nazis chose to build their death camps, was not just a litany of suffering and persecution, leading inexorably to the Holocaust. The Jews had a 1,000-year history in Poland. Anti-Semitism was ever present, as it was pretty much everywhere in Europe. But as well as times of bitter oppression, there were long periods when Jewish life expanded and flourished, and they interacted fruitfully with their neighbours. We need to know how Jews lived in Poland in the decades and indeed in the centuries before their mass murder. Because it was not just people who were destroyed, it was a culture, a language, a literature, a whole civilization, and one that included radical progressive movements struggling for a better world, especially in the 1920s and 30s. Between the two world wars, Warsaw was described as a bustling, commercial, overcrowded and noisy city. In 1939, its multicultural population was 1.3 million, of whom 1/3 were Yiddish-speaking Jews, with smaller numbers of other ethnic or cultural groups. Soon after the German army invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, they issued orders confining the Jews to certain areas of the cities, ghettos, which they then surrounded with high walls to separate them from the rest of the world. There were hundreds of ghettos across German-occupied and annexed Poland and the Soviet Union alone. In Warsaw, one of its citizens, plus more from surrounding towns, Jews and also the Sinti and Roma, were crowded into about 4% of the total area of the city. There was immense suffering. Thousands and thousands of people starved to death and died of diseases that ran rampant through the desperately crowded, overcrowded ghetto. The Germans ordered the Jewish community to establish a Jewish council, a Judenrat, to administer life in the ghetto and impose Nazi authority on it. The extent to which they willingly collaborated or tried to mitigate the Nazi terror is still controversial today. But there was also an underground. Food and other necessities, as well as people, were smuggled across the wall in both directions. Bunkers were built where people could be hidden. Soup kitchens were set up, and under their cover, teachers ran classes, weapons were stored, meetings were held. There were theatres, secret libraries, concerts, creative cultural activities that sustained people socially and psychologically. In the summer of 1942, the Nazis carried out their first mass deportation. Between July and September, around 265,000 Jews were marched to a railway siding designed for loading goods onto the trains, the Umschlagplatz, at the northernmost point of the ghetto. There they were crammed into cattle trucks and taken to Treblinka. This camp, concealed in the middle of a forest, had only one purpose: death. By the time the empty trains returned to Warsaw the following day, the previous deportees had already been killed. This spurred some of the remaining inhabitants of the ghetto, particularly those who had been in youth movements prior to the war, to organize armed resistance. They set up the Jewish Fighting Organization, the ZOB, which included left Zionists, Bundists, and communists, and others aged between 13 and 40. With some support from partisans outside the ghetto, they smuggled in weapons and explosives, they built bunkers and tunnels between the buildings, and established lines of command. On the 19th of April 1943, the eve of Passover, the first Seder night, Nazi soldiers marched in to attempt the final liquidation of the ghetto, and the German troops were taken off guard when shots came from 4 directions, killing them all. It took the German army 3 weeks to defeat the ragtag group of fighters with their smuggled weapons and homemade bombs. When the end was inevitable on the 8th of May, 1943, most of those left alive in the command bunker at 18 Miller Street committed suicide or were killed with the remaining population as the Germans threw gas bombs into the bunkers and torched the entire ghetto. A few fighters escaped through the sewers, hoping to join partisans in Warsaw and the forests. This episode of courage, humanity, and heroism has its own backstory. Those fighters had only survived their years of bitter privation in the ghetto because of everyday acts of support, solidarity, and mutual aid. They would not have been there without the care, the bravery, the determination and hope of ordinary women and men that they could and would help each other to survive. And that in turn would not have been possible if the strong cultural, political, social networks and institutions, schools, youth movements, welfare and mutual aid groups, as well as links with non-Jewish Polish progressives, had not been built and nurtured within the Jewish community in the decades before the war. As well as the trips to Auschwitz, I've co-organized 2 delegations from the Jewish Socialist Group to Warsaw to meet a new generation of Polish activists, Jewish and non-Jewish, who are determined to keep this history alive. Every year, on or around the 19th of April, they organize a commemoration event which includes Yiddish songs sung by school children from a humanist school in Warsaw. They commemorate both the armed uprising and also those who quietly resisted and whose names are not remembered. They march along the route that the ghetto Jews took to the Umschlagplatz, starting from an amazing monument to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising at the heart of the former ghetto. And I'm going to come to an end soon, but I want to show you an image of this monument. I'm aware, Georgina, that I'm running out of time. I won't take much longer. So here is the front of this monument, which is a remarkable, powerful image. And I'm now going to show you the back of that image, because that the front is the heroic ghetto fighters in their rags of clothes, which was all they had. And on the other side of this monument is an image of the Jews being driven to the Umschlagplatz. And in the background, I don't know if you can see there, that you can see some Nazi helmets. And this monument was designed by a young man called Natan Rapoport, who escaped from Warsaw and went eastwards, and he survived the war in the Soviet Union. While he was there, his artistic talent was noticed and he was accepted into an art school where he studied sculpture. When he heard about the uprising in 1943 in his hometown, he made a small model of this monument, which on one side has this powerful socialist realist style sculpture of the fighters in their ragged clothes, and on the other, the bas-relief of the Jews being herded to the Umschlagplatz. After the war, this monument was built on the ruins of the ghetto, and Warsaw was just completely devastated. The ghetto didn't exist, it was just a pile of rubble. And it was built using stone that the Nazis had ordered from Sweden on Hitler's orders for a planned victory monument, which of course they never used. I'll end now by telling you about an account of the uprising called The Ghetto Fights, which was written by Marek Edelman, a Bundist and a doctor and a Jewish socialist. He was the deputy commander of the Jewish Fighting Organization, and he survived the war and lived in Poland until his death in 2009. And I'll finish with his anti-nationalist, anti-racist words, which are still much too apt today. He wrote, "In 1943, we fought for the life of Jewish society in Warsaw. We fought solely for life, not for territory, and not for national identity." Like Marek Edelman, today we need to understand not just what we're fighting against, but we need a clear vision of a world of freedom, equality, and justice that we're fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Julia. And I think it was really special actually to hear about the Jewish resistance movement and the fighting organisation, because that's not something that gets taught in schools. So yes, we will now enter into a Q&A. So please submit your questions using the Q&A function, and we'll try and get as many answered as possible. So the first question is from Phil Katz, and I'll just read it out. "Julia is so right. This was no momentary madness at the Wanesi, sorry, I butchered that completely, conference. The majority of participants were lawyers and holders of PhDs. They agreed and aimed to kill all 11 million Jews. In the end, they got 6 million. If it were not for the Red Army in the East, blocking Hitler's path to Palestine, Iraq, and Syria, the Holocaust would have been near total. With the survivors now mounting to a few hundreds, and the obvious witnesses to genocide disappearing, how can we relate the experience and lessons to a new, younger audience?" Who would like to answer this question first? Julia, perhaps? Oh, you're muted, sorry. Oh, you're still muted, sorry. There we go.
Okay. It's really difficult. And it's getting more difficult nowadays to teach proper history. The new and younger audience, I mean, I think there is a new and younger audience. It's probably very, very difficult to teach this in schools, but I think that there are other opportunities. I mean, one of the things that we've seen recently within the Jewish community is a rise in activism amongst young Jewish people who are looking at the history that they've been taught and the received wisdom that they've had, and are looking for themselves again at this history. And I think it's really important that we engage with them. But I think one of the possibilities that is opening up to us is that we can engage with young people alongside them in activism, and that's a much more convincing way than trying to talk to them from above and treat them as though they're empty vessels that we have to pour information into. The history is contested, and it will go on being contested. And one of the frightening things at the moment is that people are blocked and silenced and cancelled for disagreeing with each other. And I think one of the things that we do have to fight for is the right to disagree, the right to offend, the right to explore, and the right to be wrong, and the right to change our minds. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with the activism point actually, because I'm still in education, and I've learned way more about the Holocaust since leaving secondary school, and I've actually learned that through being in the broad movement. So I completely agree with that. I had Rob's hand first.
Yes, it does seem to me as if we are facing a major problem in terms of people learning about the Holocaust and learning lessons from the Holocaust. I'm sure there already are. Well, I know there are already in existence some very good materials on the web. There are printed materials. There are in some places packs that have been prepared for schools and so on. I'm wondering, first of all, whether we are all doing enough in our different organizations. I'm not reflecting upon, any other organizations here, but I'm certainly very conscious of the fact that I think we could be doing more in the Communist Party to make these materials more widely available and to direct people towards them. And also, in particular, to direct people towards the very good resources that are out there on the web and elsewhere that counter the lies and the myths of the Holocaust deniers. I've raised the possibility, and I will raise it until it's done. I would like to see on our websites, for example, a very easy to find guide as to where the best resources are, so that people who want to learn more about the Holocaust and about explode the myths of Holocaust denial will straight away see where they can go to get those arguments. And Julia, in her marvelous presentation, has shown us some of the illustrations that are available, some of the photographic evidence. There are recordings of witnesses and so on. There's plenty of this stuff there. It's whether we are selecting it and gathering it together and making it more widely available. I think that's the task that we really have not got to grips with. Not all the organizations. Some do nothing but that, quite rightly. But I think there's more that we could do.
Thank you. Lucy?
I think what was so powerful about listening to Julia speak, and it was really powerful and a very moving presentation, was that it captured both historical event, but also a kind of a sort of effective power as well, something about what also working together achieved, what it meant to resist. And I think it's that there's a difference between a kind of representation of something in the past, which people may not engage with or understand how it might connect to current experience, and what the kind of thing that Julia was talking about. So I think how we teach, how we try and create spaces for learning is really important, and the kind of learning that we do. And I'm really conscious, and I think this is a much broader question, but it really goes to the root of some of the major problems today, is that the ways in which we are compelled and prompted to interact with each other on these very powerful platforms that people use is something which freezes people's positions, which is a disavowal of history itself. So things like social media on what was Twitter and is now X, it has no history. People are forever damned and viewed as irredeemable for having had a position once. And that is a denial and a disavowal of politics itself. It's a denial and disavowal of the potential of politics and dialogue to change people's views. And I think one of the things we have to do is to resist that idea and to always retain spaces which are open to dialogue, rather than freezing and people in one position forever as if they are completely irretrievable. Because I think that is part of a politics which is absolutely at odds with a kind of a socialist position. So I think as well, I think we need to be really mindful of the kinds of places and how we encourage people to have these conversations and be open to the possibility that, and the hope, the massive hope I have, that people change how they think and what they do. So I don't know if it answers Phil's question, but I think it goes to that sort of issue of it not just being about what we teach or about how we do it and where those things take place. And I think Julia's right. Those kinds of spaces for activism are good places to have these conversations.
Thank you for that. So we'll just go on to the next question. So from David. The British establishment tells itself a self-congratulatory history of its role in defeating the Nazis, but it could be argued that the response of the British state before, during, and after the Holocaust had many failings. Do you agree? And what were some of those failings? Who would like to go first? Rob? You're muted, comrade.
The most widely used phrase in the English language. You are muted. I do agree with David. And the history has always been rewritten and falsified on quite a grand. There's a lot that needs to be falsified if the criminal record is to be covered up, and this happens. This certainly happens in Britain. The anti-Semitism that has long existed in society here and flared up from time to time on a big scale and on in many smaller ways. I'm from Cardiff. We're quite proud of a history as a multiracial city from the dock, but we had anti-Jewish riots in Cardiff in the 20th century. So these episodes, we have to remind ourselves that we shouldn't have an air of superiority in terms of our record in combating or failing to combat anti-Semitism, and of tolerating. At the same time, and that absolutely must be done, and the record of the British state, including the duplicity in terms of how the Holocaust is reported and the Nuremberg trials were reported and are remembered and so on, that has to be uncovered. At the same time, I think we have to be careful not to exaggerate in the other direction as far as the mass of people are concerned, without romanticizing that. The fact is that, in the 20th century, anti-Semitism has been vigorously opposed in some quarters, particularly with the attempts by fascism to take root here in the 20s and 30s. There were mass mobilizations against that. We celebrate the victory at Cable Street. I don't think we do enough to celebrate some of the other great victories that were won in different parts of Britain. And I don't think, as long as we report and celebrate the victory over fascism in the Second World War in a way that's clear that is what it represents, I don't think we should be too shy about coverage of the Second World War in documentaries, meetings, publications, and so on. There is a tendency in some quarters, particularly from those who want to defend Israel uncritically, who want to smear its critics and so on. They try and make out that, why are we always going on about the war and so on? Why does the left and why do, and all the rest of it. I think we're quite right to celebrate the Second World War, but we should celebrate it for that aspect in particular, the victory over fascism, and the role that everybody played in that victory, including the role that millions of ordinary people in Britain played, but also the role, of course, that the Soviet Union played. So, I do agree with it's the criticism of the role of the British state historically that has largely gone unmentioned, unbroadcast, and we have to put that right. But at the same time, and I don't think David was suggesting this, that doesn't mean that we should be that celebrating the victory in the Second World War is some exercise in empire nostalgia, and the sooner we move away from it, the better. What we've got to do is focus on the really significant, historically necessary elements of that historic victory.
Thank you for that, Rob. I'll take one more question, but if we keep answers brief. So this is from Ruben. I've seen statistics from the USA. Oh, sorry, Julia. You're muted.
Could I just add something briefly
Yeah.
to answer that question? I mean, the British state was riddled with anti-Semitism. Edward VIII was a Nazi. The government throughout the 30s refused to let more than a handful of refugees come into this country from Nazi Germany, although they knew very well what was happening to them. The much celebrated Kindertransport was organized, paid for, and fought for privately. The British state did not pay a single halfpenny for any of those children and only let them in if they left their parents behind to what was certain death. You know, and after the war, survivors weren't allowed to come here either. You know, it's a dreadful, dreadful story. And Cable Street itself was fought, you know, very much against the wishes and the forces of the state, and not with their blessing. When the black shirts were threatening the biggest Jewish community in this country at the time. And some members of the government were dragged kicking and screaming into the war against Nazi Germany, and not to save the Jews, I don't think, really. They had other reasons for finally going to war with Germany. So I think it is really important to tell that story. That's not to detract from the importance of the victory, but you know, people were risking absolutely everything to smuggle out news of what was happening. The mass murder in Auschwitz was known about. The government was begged to bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz and the other death camps, and refused to do so. So, you know, all of that needs to be explored. Those questions need to be looked at, you know, and you know, there are reasons for their decisions. They may not be reasons we agree with, but you know, that history needs to be examined properly and with humanity.
Thank you for that, Julia. I'm going to apologise to Ruben for not answering the question, but just as we're drawing to 3:30, I'd like to end on time. Do we have any closing remarks from our speakers? Dan?
Thanks, Georgina. Yeah, these are really important questions. I thought I would maybe try to address them all just in one go and make a closing remark. I think they can be summarized essentially in how do we keep the memory of the victims of the Holocaust and the Holocaust itself alive for future generations and for our own generation. I alluded to this at the very beginning of my remarks. It is crucially important. This is not just an academic exercise. This plays into how we frame our political discourse today and how we frame the future itself. I mean, I mentioned, for instance, that historical revisionism serves an ideological purpose. And I referred to the Organization of Ukrainian Nazis, who coined a term such as the Holodomor, which was the name, which only came out as recently as the 1980s and was used to describe the terrible famine of Ukraine and that region, 1931 to 1933. This very much plays into that overt desire to see the Holocaust as one of many such instances. The very name itself, Holodomor, is designed to rival the word Holocaust. It sounds almost identical. It is, as I say, an OUN fascist idea justifying anti-Jewish pogroms as retribution for the excesses or otherwise of the communist governments and the Soviets prior to Second World War. No serious academic, by the way, takes seriously that the famine of 31 to 33 was man-made. There were certainly reasons for why it was exacerbated, but the fact is the Soviets did not start the famine, they ended it, and they ended the periodic cyclical famines in the region for good. But the point I'm making is that it doesn't matter. The ideological groundwork has been done by this invidious and pervasive rewriting of history, which overrides the facts and the deliberate diminishment of the Holocaust as merely one of many. I'm going to refer very quickly, if you don't mind, just to a couple of comments that came out online when I was promoting this event. The first one, which in reference to Holocaust Memorial Day, how tone deaf, pushing Zionist victim narrative while they slaughter Palestinians. And another one, a worthwhile exercise. Will you also be holding an online webinar to mark victims of Communism Memorial Day, commemorated on the 7th of November in the United States? I think if there is any doubt whatsoever about or question as to whether Holocaust Memorial Day is necessary and important, there's your evidence. I refer to those comments. I refer also to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who referred to Auschwitz as having been liberated by the Allied forces. The question was asked earlier. The knowledge of the Holocaust is diminishing, and whilst we can semantically say that the Soviet Union was one of the Allies, the insinuation is quite clear. This was supposed to initiate that there were Americans and there were British as well as Russians at the liberation of Auschwitz, which is patently not the case. And I think that this lack of historical understanding is paying into these types of almost false narratives. So I'll just conclude by saying that our task is to challenge this so that the memory of the victims of the Holocaust may never be diminished, and so that we never see it happen again. I mentioned before that the human cost of ending it was absolutely tremendous, and it is incumbent upon us that we never allow it to happen again.
Thank you for that, and thank you everyone for attending. Just some reminders from me. The Communist Party is having a programme put out on anti-Semitism, and so I'd encourage everyone to sign up when that comes out. If you have any questions or want to get involved in anti-racist, anti-fascist work, contact the ARAF Commission or Tony. And please ensure that after this meeting, you take this back to your branches, districts and nations so that we can do this work where we live. So yeah, thank you all for attending and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Very good.
Thank you.